Welcome back to my channel. Today we are taking a look at vinegar pie. This is an old Depression-era recipe that's a little bit strange. It kind of has a cult following even to this day, and it's something that would have been served in the 1930s and 40s at rural fairs. You know, they had pie contests at those old-timey fairs, and apparently this was a big hit. And I think it's because it's so unique. You probably wouldn't find anything like it today unless you were searching for it, and even then it'd be hard to find. But people like to make it because during the Depression you couldn't get things like lemons and limes and oranges. Things like that were very scarce. So this was a way to mimic those flavors without having the actual fruit. So what is vinegar pie? Well, basically it's a mixture of vinegar and sugar and spices with a pie crust. That's pretty much it. Of course, there are different variations on this. Sometimes people will add things like apples or raisins or other fruits, but mostly it's just vinegar. So here's an example of one of those recipes. For the filling, you're going to take 2 cups of vinegar. Now it says to use your best vinegar. I don't know what that means. Maybe like a brand name vinegar. Then you're going to add 1/2 cup of granulated sugar, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1 and 2 teaspoons of ground cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of ground cloves, 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, and 1/4 teaspoon of pepper. Some recipes call for a little bit of flour just to kind of help thicken it up a little bit. You can do that, or you can just leave it as is. This would be good if you had like apple cider or some kind of spiced vinegar, maybe even a blueberry vinegar. I've seen those around. That would probably be good in this. Now, the original recipe does call for lemon peel and lemon juice, but I'm guessing that was for flavor, and you could probably do without it. You would just use more of the vinegar. So you're gonna mix all that up and set it aside. Then you're gonna roll out your pie crust, put it in a pie pan, fill it up, put the top crust on, crimp it down, and then you're gonna roll out the extra dough and cut out some little shapes just to decorate the top of the pie. You can do little leaves, or you can do like little flowers. It's totally up to you. Bake it according to your pie crust directions. Usually pie crusts take about 15 minutes or so, and then while the pie is baking, you're going to mix up the glaze. The glaze is just powdered sugar and milk mixed together. You want it to be the consistency of like honey. And then once your pie is done baking, you're going to pour that glaze on top. Now, I have never actually made this before, so I don't know how it's going to turn out. It's kind of scary to me. But if you have ever tried this, let me know how it turned out in the comments below. Did you win any blue ribbons? Let me know. I'm curious. Also, if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have you ever heard of deep-fried butter? No, not that fake internet thing. We're talking about real butter, like from the cow, battered and then fried. Yeah, it's a thing. And it's almost as disgusting as it sounds. It first appeared at Iowa's State Fair in the early 2000s, and it shocked the nation. People either loved it or hated it, but they couldn't stop talking about it. It was the fair food of the year, and for a brief moment in time, it was everywhere. But how exactly do you deep fry butter? The process is painfully simple, though maybe a little bit unhealthy. Take some butter, freeze it, then put it in a batter like you would for something you'd actually want to eat, like onion rings or French fries. After that, you just drop it into some hot oil, wait a few minutes, and then you have yourself a snack. It's kind of like a mozzarella stick, except instead of melted cheese, you have solid butter inside. The most popular way to serve it is with a side of honey mustard for dipping, although some places also offer ranch and blue cheese dressing. The invention of deep-fried butter was completely accidental. A chef named Rick Bacon was trying to make fried cheese curds, but he messed up and put in way too much butter. So he had to get creative, and he came up with the idea of deep-fried butter sticks. At first, no one knew what to make of it, but eventually people warmed up to the idea and it became a summertime favorite. For a while, deep-fried butter was a staple at the Iowa State Fair, but over the years, it's become less and less common. In recent years, there have only been a few scattered reports of deep-fried butter making appearances at various county fairs across the country. It's safe to say that deep-fried butter is a niche food item. Not many people are brave enough to try it, and even fewer are willing to admit they like it. But hey, if you're ever at a county fair and you see a stand selling deep-fried butter, go for it. You're in for a night you'll never forget. Have you ever wondered why we stopped dipping apples in candy? Hi, I'm here with my channel. And although caramel apples are delicious, they weren't always the go-to fall treat. In fact, there was another apple that took center stage before caramel took over. And no, it wasn't candy corn. It was candy apples. These glossy red orbs were the star of autumn fairs and festivals, especially during the 1800s and early 1900s. The idea was simple. You take a tart green apple, dip it in a sugary syrup, and then roll it around in a bed of chopped nuts. Voila! An instant fall treat that both kids and adults could enjoy. But how did these candy apples become so popular? Well, for starters, they were a fun twist on a classic fall activity. After all, who doesn't love apples? And what's more fun than a plain apple? A sweet and sticky candy apple. Not only were candy apples a delicious treat, but they also became a symbol of the season. As soon as the weather started to cool down and the leaves began to turn, people knew that candy apples were back. They were a reminder that fall had arrived and it was time to celebrate. And what better way to celebrate than by going to an apple orchard or a fair where you could pick your own apples, have them chopped up right in front of you and then dipped in hot, bubbly caramel. It was an experience that brought people together. Families would pick out the perfect apples together and then take turns licking the sticky syrup off the wooden stick. Friends would catch up over their shared love of candy apples while waiting in line for the Ferris wheel. And couples would share a sweet moment as they bit into the crunchy candy coating and tasted the sweet, juicy apple inside. But like all good things, candy apples eventually went out of style. So what happened? Well, it all comes down to one thing: versatility, or lack thereof. Candy apples were delicious, but they were also a bit one-dimensional. Sure, you could roll them in different types of nuts, but for the most part, candy apples were pretty much the same. No matter where you got them, they were sweet, sticky, and a little bit messy. And while those qualities made them a fun occasional treat, they didn't exactly scream versatility. Caramel apples, on the other hand, were a blank canvas for flavor. They were less sweet, more savory, and could be topped with all sorts of things, from chocolate sauce to bacon bits to chopped nuts. They were also a bit more sophisticated, which is why they started showing up at high-end restaurants and gourmet food halls. So while we may never know what it was like to bite into a candy apple back in the day, we can still savor the taste of a well-made caramel apple. Just don't call them caramel candies. That's just weird. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe and check out our other videos. Have you ever seen bacon covered in chocolate? Well, during the 1990s and 2000s, this was a popular dish at state fairs across the United States. The combination of sweet and salty flavors was so shocking that it made national headlines. But what is it about this dish that was so strange? And why did it disappear? It all started with a chef named Harry L. Miller. In the 1990s, he created a dessert called chocolate-covered bacon at the Minnesota State Fair. The dish consisted of fresh, never-frozen bacon cooked in chocolate. And although it sounds simple, the preparation was actually quite complicated. Miller would take 2 strips of bacon and carefully cut them so they were exactly the same size. He would then roll them up together and secure them with a toothpick. Then came the most important part, dipping the bacon in melted chocolate. Each piece had to be dipped twice, once for a thin coating and again for a thicker one. After letting them dry, Miller would add a little more chocolate on top and sprinkle on some chopped nuts. The whole thing was then deep fried, and once it was all finished, the dish looked like a pair of chocolate-covered cigars. Although it may not look very appetizing, the dish was apparently very tasty. It combined the savory flavor of bacon with the richness of chocolate and the crunchiness of the nuts. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what the recipe was, or else I would make it myself. The dish became so popular that other chefs started making it too. At the Iowa State Fair, you could buy chocolate-covered bacon from a vendor named Burgon's. Their recipe was a little different, though. Instead of fresh bacon, they used pre-cooked bacon that they cut into bite-sized pieces. Then they would melt down chocolate bars with nuts and then coat the bacon in the chocolate. As the years went on, more and more headlines were written about this bizarre food item. In 2006, the Associated Press wrote an article titled, "Chocolate-Covered Bacon, Anyone?" In it, they described how this dish was taking the country by storm. Apparently, vendors were selling out of this dish left and right. Some even ran out and had to stop selling it midway through the fair. But despite its popularity, it seems like no one took credit for inventing the dish. Some articles mention Harry L. Miller, but most of them don't. It almost seems like people were embarrassed to be associated with creating such a strange dish. Today, it's very difficult to find chocolate-covered bacon at any state fair. It seems like this fad died out sometime in the late 2000s. There are still pictures and videos of it on the internet, but it's unlikely that we'll ever see it again. If you ever tried this dish, I would love to hear your thoughts. Did you like it? Why do you think it disappeared? Let me know in the comments. And this is 1 Minute Food History. Today we are going to talk about corn on the cob. This American barbecue staple, corn on the cob dipped in butter buckets. I don't know about you, but I love corn on the cob. I love the sweet summer taste of it. I love the way that it feels in my mouth. I also love the idea of dipping it into a big old bucket of melted butter. In fact, during the 19th century at state fairs, you could find whole corn cobs dunked into communal melted butter tubs. That sounds like a terrible idea from a health standpoint, but it was a nostalgic delight for many Americans. But eventually, those communal butter buckets disappeared. No one really knows exactly why this happened, but food historians believe that the decline of the butter bucket may have had something to do with the rise of commercialized corn on the cob. By the late 1800s, several companies had sprung up across the United States that were selling canned or bottled corn. And by the 1930s, the first frozen corn hit the market. These were not only cheaper and easier to prepare than fresh corn, but they also provided a more consistent product. You always knew what you were going to get when you bought a can or a box of corn. And then in the 1950s, things changed. Supermarkets began to sell pre-packaged corn in individual butter packets. And while these butter packets were convenient, they weren't exactly an improvement from a hygiene standpoint. But by this time, people had largely forgotten about the communal butter buckets of days gone by. So no one really thought twice about the fact that they were now dipping their corn into little containers of mystery meat juice. They just thought, this is great. We don't have to clean our hands. But it wasn't until the 2003 Summer Olympics in Athens that the world really saw just how disgusting this practice was. You see, the Olympic Village cafeteria was serving corn on the cob with pre-packaged butter sticks. And while this was a far cry from the communal butter buckets of the 19th century, it was apparently filthy in its own right. The Washington Post reported that these butter sticks were unhygienic and that the sight of athletes licking the butter off the corn was giving other athletes and even some cafeteria workers shivers. One cafeteria worker told the Post, "It's a nightmare. People just dip their corn in the butter, then drop them back into the boiling water, and then take them out and eat them. Yikes." After that, pre-packaged butter sticks largely fell out of favor, and corn on the cob either came with no butter or with individually wrapped butter portions. Have you ever heard of fried ice cream balls? Probably not if you're under 40. These were all the rage at state fairs in the 1980s and 90s. Basically, they were deep-fried ice cream scoops that were then coated in corn flakes. They were both a novelty and a dessert, and also an engineering marvel, because keeping ice cream cold while deep-frying it is actually pretty difficult. The way they made these was by taking a scoop of ice cream, usually vanilla or chocolate, placing it on a hot griddle to melt just slightly, then rolling it into a ball shape and letting it hit a cold surface to harden again. It would then be coated in crushed cornflakes and then deep-fried in neutral oil like canola oil at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And yes, they did use the same fryer for the cornflake coating, but they would always fry the ice cream balls in batches so they wouldn't overbeat the ice cream. They were so popular at state fairs that many fairgoers would make them their first meal of the day. And yes, they did have nutritional information readily available upon request. One of these bad boys had 720 calories, 10 grams of protein, 130 grams of carbs, and a whopping 40 grams of fat. After the 90s, they started popping up in Mexican restaurants, likely due to the introduction of the dessert menu. But they never really caught on in the culinary world and have since vanished from restaurants and fairs alike. So, have you ever tried fried ice cream balls? Would you try them today? Let us know in the comments below. And with that being said, we're gonna go ahead and end this one. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed. And if you did, don't forget to leave us a like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, take care. Have you ever seen giant brittle sheets being cracked with hammers at the fair? It's a spectacle that's hard to miss with all the noise and commotion. But it wasn't always this way. In the early 1900s, peanut brittle was a must-buy sweet for families at the fall fair. But how did they get these enormous slabs of candy? Well, it started with a simple recipe that has stood the test of time. Sugar, peanuts, and corn syrup, all three ingredients were cooked together in a big kettle over an open fire. The mixture was then spread out on a giant marble slab to cool. And once it was cut up, the pieces were ready to be packaged and sold. But not all customers were satisfied with just a small piece of brittle. So some vendors came up with a novel idea. They would take 2 pieces of brittle and stick them together to make a slab twice as thick. Then they would tie the ends together and hang it from a board. Finally, they would whack the board with a hammer, separating the brittle into large chunks that were nearly as big as the customer's head. And the best part, each piece was individually wrapped so they could be sold individually or in bulk. These giant brittle slabs were a fair favorite for decades, but they fell out of style in the 1970s when packaged candy became more popular. But thankfully, there are still a few vendors keeping the tradition alive. Have you ever seen a potato cooked on a stick? Well, neither have I until recently. Back in the 1970s, there was a fairground food fad, a sort of tornado potato, if you will. But instead of a modern take with shoestring fries, it was whole raw potatoes that were spiral sliced and then fried on a stick. The finished result was so impressive that people would pay up to $5 just to try one. And yes, believe it or not, that's the same price as a Big Mac today. Of course, the biggest challenge was getting the insides out without making a mess. So vendors would actually suck the insides out through the skin with a straw after it was cooked. Then they'd fill the center hole with butter or cheese or even ice cream. Yeah, really. And if you didn't want your potato to unravel, vendors would actually tie the ends together with string so it wouldn't fall apart in your hands. Although this dish might look fancy, it was actually born out of necessity. See, back in the 70s, fast food was starting to get really popular. And in order to compete with the likes of McDonald's, fairground vendors had to get creative with their menus to entice customers. And what better way to do that than with a giant spiral of fried potato? Although this dish never really took off, it did inspire another famous food item that we still eat today. Can you name that? Well, I'll give you a hint. It's cheesy. In the 1980s, a restaurant in Wisconsin called the Cheesy Potato was serving up a similar dish. They took a whole potato, fill it with cheese curds, and then deep fry it. The result was so popular that soon every state fair was selling them. And today you can even buy frozen ones in the supermarket. So the next time you enjoy a cheesy potato, you'll know what to thank. And speaking of things you might want to thank, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have you ever seen a sandwich this big? Well, if you were around in the early 1900s and had a thing for pork, you might have seen one of these bad boys at your local county fair. These gigantic sandwiches were called prize hogs, a play on the word prize hog, which is a pig that has been specially bred and entered into competitions at these county fairs. The way it worked was simple. Farmers would raise the biggest pigs they could, enter them into the fair's animal competitions, and then, after they won, they'd take their prize hogs straight to the nearest sandwich shop and have them sliced up right there on the spot into thick slabs of bacon. That bacon would then be piled high on a crusty bread roll with some tomato slices and a pickle spear. And because these things were so enormous, they were often served with a side of mashed potatoes. The sandwich got its name from the fact that the winning pigs were often so big that they took home the blue ribbon or other prize for being the biggest pig at the fair. The idea of the sandwich was to give fairgoers a chance to try some of the finest pork that this country had to offer, as well as, of course, to celebrate the farmers who had raised them. There aren't many of these sandwiches left today, but there are a few recipes floating around out there on the internet. And if you're feeling ambitious, why not give one a try? You can find a recipe for prize hog sandwiches by clicking the link in the description below. Thanks for watching, guys. If you liked this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more historical tales, including more stories about food and recipes from history. There's a lot more where this came from. If you've ever gone to a county fair or a small town festival, you may have noticed something in common. Almost all of them have a pie-eating contest, but not all of them have a Jell-O mold-eating contest. But from the 1950s to the 1970s, they were almost as popular as pie, at least in some parts of the country. And while today we think of Jell-O as a simple dessert or a weird food science experiment back then, people took their Jell-O very seriously, as in they would spend hours crafting these enormous colorful molds that sometimes took up an entire table, and then they would cut them up and eat them with a spoon. Now, this all started after World War II, when gelatin or Jell-O became a very popular food item. It was cheap, it was easy to make, and most importantly, it was trendy. All the cool kids were eating Jell-O, and not just for dessert either. They were serving it as a side dish with entrees and even as a beverage. But no one took their Jell-O obsession further than those who entered it into county fair competitions. And if you want to see some of these entries, all you have to do is look at some old cookbooks or just search online for things like vintage Jell-O molds or retro gelatin desserts. You will find some truly bizarre creations, many of which look less like food and more like a piece of modern art. And of course, there's no shortage of luridly colored Jell-O molds either. Just look at this one made to resemble a lobster. Or how about this vaguely humanoid figure? Oh, and don't worry, if you wanted to, you could totally eat this one. In fact, people did. After the Jell-O mold was finished being judged, many of them were cut up and served to fairgoers who were more than happy to sample these colorful creations. And while it might seem kind of gross to us today, keep in mind that back then, food safety standards were a lot more lax. Plus, gelatin doesn't really go bad. So as long as you don't mind the possibility of some teenage boys spitting into the communal bowl, your chances of getting a foodborne illness from eating this are probably pretty low. Of course, you could also just make your own Jell-O mold at home and bring it to the next county fair. But before you get too excited, you should know that this trend largely died out in the 1980s. Maybe it was because people started to worry about the health implications of eating so much processed food. Maybe it was because gelatin became harder to find. Or maybe it was because people just got tired of eating Jell-O that looked like a deformed alien creature. Whatever the reason, this bizarre culinary tradition is largely a thing of the past today. And now all we have are some pictures and maybe a few old cookbooks with titles like Gelatin, Glorious Gelatin. Yum. This is one of the largest cotton candy ever, and the sticks were nearly as big as the kids that were eating them. Welcome to my channel. During the 1960s, fairs and carnivals across the United States were known for their massive fresh-spun cones of cotton candy. These colossal confections were not only a delicious treat, but also a symbol of the fun and excitement that these events had to offer. The tradition of serving cotton candy at fairs and carnivals can be traced back to the late 19th century when it was introduced as a novelty item. It quickly became a crowd favorite and its popularity soared. By the mid-20th century, cotton candy was being served at almost every major fair and carnival in the country. One of the main reasons for its widespread appeal was the novelty of the experience. In addition to its unique texture and flavor, the way that cotton candy was presented was also a major draw. It was often spun into large, elaborate shapes, such as animals or flowers, and then placed on a stick for easy consumption. Kids would line up for these massive cones of cotton candy, which were nearly as big as their heads. They would take great pride in their sugary purchase and happily pose for photos with their prize. The sheer size of these cotton candy creations was not only impressive, but also a bit intimidating. Some cones were so large that it took several people to eat them, and it wasn't uncommon for kids to get their hands stuck in the sticky mess. Despite the occasional mishap, the experience of eating such a colossal cotton candy creation was something that most kids only dreamed of. Unfortunately, this tradition of serving massive cotton candy on sticks began to decline in the latter half of the 20th century. As fairs and carnivals became less common and more commercialized, the novelty of these events wore off, and with it, the popularity of giant cotton candy creations also waned. Today, cotton candy is still a popular treat at fairs and carnivals, but it's more likely to be served in individual bags rather than on a giant cone. What are your thoughts on this? Do you remember a time when you had a giant cotton candy on a stick? Share your thoughts below. Have you ever wondered what an elephant ear is? Well, I'm going to tell you all about it. So these are elephant ears. They used to be the thing at county fairs in the 1950s. You know, before funnel cakes took over, elephant ears were the thing. Now, some people like to call them elephant ears because they look like elephant ears. But other people call them elephant ears because the dough that makes them is so tough, it's like working with an elephant's ear. Now, the very first elephant ear was invented by a guy named George Boyington. He was an engineer, and he owned a restaurant called Boyington's in Dayton, Ohio. And in 1950, he came up with this idea of deep frying a piece of dough so large that it could feed an entire family. He called it an elephant ear because the dough was so tough and chewy, it was like trying to work with an elephant's ear. These elephant ears were a hit. People loved them, and soon every county fair in the Midwest had its own elephant ear stand. They were always covered with powdered sugar, and sometimes cinnamon sugar. And if you didn't get your elephant ear at the fair, you could get them at ball games and even drive-in movies. Now, the best part about elephant ears is they're really easy to make. All you need is some flour, water, salt, sugar, and shortening. And you can make them at home. You just mix up a big batch of dough, roll it out, fry it in neutral oil like canola oil or rice oil at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and you want to fry them off in batches so the oil doesn't get too cold and the elephant ears don't get soggy. You're gonna fry them until GBD. That means golden brown and delicious. Then you throw them in a strainer to drain, and then you roll them in sugar. If you want, you can roll them in cinnamon sugar. It's really good. And elephant ears are really versatile. You can make savory ones with salt and pepper, or you can roll them up with some cream cheese. I mean, really, the possibilities are endless. Now, elephant ears have been around since the 1950s, and they're still around today. So if you haven't tried one, you're really missing out. They're so fun to eat. They're like a party in your mouth. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of What Is It? And I hope you learned something new. If you did, give us a like and subscribe so you don't miss any more episodes. Until next time, I'm the host. And remember, don't eat the sugar. Save it for the elephant ears. Have you ever wondered why pickles are sometimes called the prize-winning pickle? Well, it has nothing to do with any beauty contest and everything to do with a now largely forgotten part of American fair culture. Have you ever seen a pickle on a stick? Probably not, because they fell out of style sometime in the 1940s. But if you'd happened to be at a state fair in the 1920s or 30s, you might have seen them being sold from barrels at the entrance to the midway. They were huge, salty, sour snacks on a stick that farm families could enjoy while walking around the fairgrounds. The tradition is believed to have started in the Midwest and the Great Lakes region, where state fairs were particularly popular. It's also believed that German immigrants played a big role in the pickle on a stick's rising popularity because German cuisine often features pickles and their distinct taste and texture. But who invented the prize-winning pickle? We don't know. No one person is credited with its invention, but we do have some clues as to how it came into being. In 1918, a man named Harry M. Southwick wrote an article for the Kansas City Star about his experiences at the 1915 St. Louis World's Fair, and in it he describes a man selling large green pickles on a stick. At the 1915 fair, food vendors weren't allowed to use barrels to hold their wares, so the man in question had to get creative. As Southwick put it, he stuck them on a long bamboo pole like a lollipop and thus was enabled to keep his wares both clean and accessible. This is the earliest written record we have of the pickle on a stick. But where did those giant pickles come from? Well, they were likely the same kind of cucumbers that were already being grown in the Midwest for the purpose of pickling. In fact, the very first prize-winning pickle may have been the result of a prank. Legend has it that one year at the Minnesota State Fair, a farmer decided to enter a giant cucumber he'd grown as an exhibit at the fair. He probably didn't think much of it, but fair officials were so surprised by the enormous cucumber that they awarded him a blue ribbon for it. The wily farmer saw an opportunity and started selling slices of the giant cucumber as pickles on a stick. And just like that, the prize-winning pickle was born. If you find yourself at a Minnesota State Fair this summer, stop by the food stand operated by the Minnesota Pickle Company. They sell prize-winning pickles on sticks and many other pickle-related products. Maybe you'll even see someone eating one with a blue ribbon tied to it. For more fun food history, stay tuned. Now with your permission, I'd like to get back to work on my entry for the Minnesota State Fair. Do you have any giant cucumbers? Have you ever wondered why turkey legs are so huge at the Renaissance Fair? Well, you're not alone. I've been wondering this for years, and after some serious research, I have the answer. The truth is, these gigantic poultry appendages were not invented by medieval butchers or even Renaissance cooks. They were born in the parking lots of state fairs in the 1950s South. You see, the post-war era brought a surge in popularity for barbecued chicken and pork. But the problem was, well, there weren't many places to get it. Fast food joints hadn't yet caught on. So resourceful Southern chefs came up with a solution. They bought whole chickens, removed the bones, and stuffed them with sawdust and plaster to make them bigger. Then they'd tie the legs together and throw them on the grill. Voila, an instant barbecue classic was born. Now, you might be thinking, that doesn't sound very appetizing, and I would have to agree with you there. But the genius part of this invention was that these oversized turkey legs could be cooked and then frozen, meaning they could be kept on hand for when customers came in. And with no refrigeration required, these turkey legs could be sold at a moment's notice from the trunk of a car, off a pushcart, or even on the street corner. In fact, this dish became so popular that it inspired copycats. Soon, other entrepreneurs were doing the same thing with turkey legs, which led to an arms race of sorts. Everyone wanted to sell the biggest, juiciest-looking drumsticks they could get their hands on. But how do you make a turkey leg bigger? The answer, it seems, is to, well, keep stuffing it with sawdust and plaster until you get the desired effect. Eventually, these monstrous meat sticks became so large that they needed to be split in half, creating the double turkey leg. And by the 1970s, these bad boys were not only a fairground staple, but also a symbol of Americana. But what does any of this have to do with the Renaissance fair? Well, as the Ren Fair craze took off in the 80s and 90s, fairgoers began to associate these oversized turkey legs with the medieval period. After all, what's more medieval than a giant turkey leg, right? And so the myth was born that these gargantuan poultry parts were some kind of medieval delicacy. In reality, though, medieval butchers probably wouldn't believe that people actually paid money for this.